Hi, I'm Jazz. Welcome back to my channel. Today is very exciting. This is the first video episode in a new series on my channel called Under the Spot Hype. Okay, so Under the Spot Hype basically stemmed from me wanting to read and promote and hype up books that I don't think are getting enough hype in the book world. Whether that's like they don't have that many reviews or ratings on Goodreads, or they might have some, but I feel that the general vibe is that people aren't talking about this book, if that makes sense, and I want to shine a spotlight on them, which is why it's called Under the Spot Hype. Hope you appreciate the pun. So that's it. They're going to be a real variety. It's going to be really reflective of my reading, but it's just me going a bit more in depth into, it's basically a book review. This is what this is, it's a book review. I want to say a big thank you to Sian from Caffeine and Commas for designing the fun logo. So for each one I'll be able to pop a different book in and it's like Under the Spot Hype. I love it. I literally love it. That is Under the Spot Hype. I hope that you enjoy. If you have any feedback on the format and things like that, I would love to hear it because this is my first series on my channel, so I am here for feedback. Without further ado, I think we should just get straight into it. I've been mulling this idea over for months and months, and as soon as I read this book, I was like, that's the one. This is the one I want to kickstart off this series with, and that is Sitting Pretty, The View from My Ordinary Resilient Disabled Body by Rebekah Taussig. I listened to this on audiobook in December and it became one of my favourite non-fictions of 2020. I've seen a few people talking about it, but I really wanted to continue to hype it because I think it's really incredible. Okay, so this book was published by Harper One in August of 2020, so it's still quite a new release. The audiobook is 7 hours and a bit, 7 hours and 33 minutes, and the hardcover I think is somewhere in the mid 200 range. So I don't usually do this with book reviews, but I think with this book I think it's really succinctly put, so I'm going to read out the synopsis that I have here for the book. Let me grab my laptop. Growing up as a paralysed girl during the 90s and early 2000s, Rebekah Taussig only saw disability depicted as something monstrous, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, inspirational, Helen Keller, or angelic, Forrest Gump. None of this felt right, as she got older, she longed for more stories that allowed disability to be complex and ordinary, uncomfortable and fine, painful and fulfilling. Writing about the rhythms and textures of what it means to live in a body that doesn't fit, Rebekah reflects on everything from the complications of kindness and charity, living both independently and dependently, experiencing intimacy, and how the pervasiveness of ableism in our everyday media directly translates to everyday life. I think that's a really good summary of the kind of topics that this book branches into and talks about, and I think the way that it is written and narrated is very accessible, especially the audiobook feels very conversational, and so I really would recommend it if you are able to listen to audiobooks because it's also narrated by Rebekah, which is really, really excellent. So as that sort of mentions, it dives into a lot of topics surrounding disability, and each chapter sort of tackles something different, but obviously not separate because everything is very interlinked. It goes into, dating whilst disabled, trying to find accessible housing, and the kind of issues with trying to find accessible housing and how few and far between they actually are, whether somewhere says it's accessible but it actually isn't. I was watching this interview and she mentioned that when trying to find accessible housing, one of the adverts labelled a house as accessible, but then when she got there the curb wasn't lowered, which is accessible for some people, but if you're in a wheelchair, that's obviously not accessible. Rebekah is a wheelchair user, and so it talks about the different types of accessibility. As well as that, it talks about health insurance and the real worries of health insurance and kind of basing your career and your job around the fact that you will need health insurance was a really interesting conversation, especially from like a US perspective with their health insurance. That was really interesting to like listen and hear and learn about. That summary also talked about the complications of kindness. That whole chapter was so interesting to hear what Rebekah had to say, especially when thinking about able-bodied people like myself, thinking you're trying to help but actually you're really not helping. And she very much talked about the view of like able-bodied people viewing disabled people as people who need your help, without recognising at all that disabled people have value and they have valuable things to offer to the conversation. It also spoke about independent dependency, and it spoke about, this is kind of like interlinked I guess in with feminism, which it talked about as well, and how the narrative within feminism is very much focused on strong independent woman, and what does that actually mean? What does a strong independent woman mean? And she reflected on it in terms of like being independent but also needing to be dependent at times within herself and within her relationship, and how actually an independent dependent relationship is very valuable, and in that way feminism can be very exclusionary to people that might not be able to be independent 100% of the time. And actually I have a quote, let me grab my laptop. I have a quote from the book in that kind of spoke about feminism as well. "My experience just doesn't match up with those I so often see touted as the experiences of women. In fact, there's this weird way in which they can seem to sit head to head, occupying opposing force fields. When I move down a street or through a store or post something online, I'm not worried that men will sexually objectify me because I'm used to my sexuality being erased, ignored, and denied by default." I found that whole passage, that whole chapter so interesting. Within the book, she told a story about being in a group of women who were all kind of talking about feminism and men, and kind of she was sort of sat there like, I can't really relate to what you're saying, and I found that really interesting because it's something I've not really thought about before, that, well, it's really obvious like in hindsight, but in terms of actively thinking about it, obviously every woman has a different experience with feminism, and that's why it's so important to have inclusive feminism, because not every person has the same experience, obviously. Honestly, I think this book was fantastic. It also talked a lot, it had a kind of mix like of personal anecdotes with some theory. There was also a chapter where Rebekah spoke about teaching a disability studies class, and the different reactions from students about this class kind of really highlighted like the, you know, disregard of people with disabilities, and the disregard of like any form of like awareness that disabilities aren't always something to be cured, and also talking about the fact that disabilities can change, and like it's not like if you're currently not disabled you can't become disabled. It's not a fixed thing, and so the unawareness of students and how they would be like, I don't need this class, it's not for me, it's not relevant to my life, was like astounding to her. It's like tough, very tough listening to it, because it's so frustrating to hear people disregard it so easily. So yeah, I think overall this was like a fantastic read. I hope I've convinced you somewhat to maybe pick it up. It was a really fantastic read, and it's really one that you should have on your radar if it's not already. I mean, it now is because I have brought it to your radar. If it's not on your radar, what am I saying? Okay, I'll link below some of the interviews I watched with Rebekah Taussig, as well as obviously her book. And yeah, that is the first episode of Under the Spot Hype. Thank you so much for watching. Look out for another Under the Spot Hype episode in the future. I'm hoping this was like a short, concise video. That was my aim, but then I get so passionate about books I love and just talk for ages. Let me know if you're interested in reading this book. If you're here and you watch to the end, but you're not in a commenty space, I see you. Just leave me a little yellow heart so that I know that you're here. Thank you again, and I will see you in a new video. Bye.